Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Patrick Tucker. I'm technology editor of the news website Defense One and author of the book The Naked Future. And today's discussion, artificial intelligence in conflict, hyperwar, no longer science fiction. It is a topic very much on the minds of leaders in Washington, in Brussels, in Moscow, in Beijing, and presumably on your mind as well. And in addition to being here today to enjoy as a participant, we hope that you will also lend us your voice, your questions. Go to slido.com, #GlobeSec, and there you can send questions that I'll be able to receive here to incorporate into the programming. We're also live on Facebook. And in particular, we're looking for your opinion on a very important question which is going to help shape our conversation here today, and that is this. We can. 20 years from now, advances in artificial intelligence will make the world more secure. Do you agree or do you not agree? Please go and to slido.com, #GlobeSec. Go ahead and vote there. And later on, we're going to look at that. Now, in the meantime, already we're beginning to see we've got some excellent opinions coming in. And to help us frame this discussion, now please help me in welcoming General Denis Mercier, the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation for NATO. Okay. Now, before we kick things off, there is a short video that's going to help us, I think, embark on this area of intellectual exploration. So let's take a look at that quickly. Okay. Well, I hope you're all sufficiently terrified. So I guess my first question, General Mercier, is a very simple one. What is your response to our poll question? In 20 years, is artificial intelligence going to make us more secure as an allied West or less secure?
In fact, artificial intelligence is just a technology. What we need to look at is what are the threats that this technology could pose against our societies, and what are the opportunities. So because I'm optimistic in nature, I think that these are the kind of technologies that will be absolutely helpful to make the world much safer, providing that we know how to use that.
How at NATO Allied Transformation Command are you looking to use this capability to change what you're doing and to change the way NATO operates?
Thank you for this question. In fact, this is a very difficult question to answer because artificial intelligence can be everywhere. And that's the difficulty because we never know where we start with that. So in order to start with a tangible, pragmatic project, we will look at different projects and with a certain level of ambition, but how we can make quick demonstrations in order to demonstrate the value of these technologies. Some demonstration could be related to how we scan the information environment in order to detect the early signs of a crisis, in order to de-escalate the crisis. NATO is a defensive organization. How we use this technology in the development of our future capabilities, individual capabilities for the nation, but the capabilities nation build together. How we use this technology to enhance the way we deploy our logistics, how we use this technology to better train our people individually and collectively, how we use this technology to enhance our lessons learned process. So these are some of the ideas we will develop in the coming months and years. But the fact is, when you look at this technology, the technology exists, and this is probably something that we do not take into account sufficiently. It's not science fiction. There is no need to look at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Of course, we need to do that, but the first thing is to understand what exists today and how we use it.
Okay. Well, and yet, as part of strategy and doctrine development, which is part of what you do, you have to look out 5 and 10 years. And so that becomes more difficult when you're talking about a technology that is developing with the exponential rapidity of artificial intelligence and machine learning. What is the main way artificial intelligence has changed your view of strategy for the West going forward?
Let's say has changed, will change, because it's the beginning idea of a journey to use this kind of technologies. But an example of that is every 4 years we update a document which name is Strategic Foresight Analysis, which is a document in which we define the trends that could lead to a crisis in the future on different areas: human area, environment, political, technology, economics. And to do that, my team, they are reading thousands of documents. Most of them have to be translated because they are written in different languages. And what we will start doing now for the future update of this document is to use data mining with a certain level of artificial intelligence, and we will take some specific regions and make a demonstration that with the use of these technologies, we probably have access to a much bigger amount of data, and based on that, probably detect signs that we would not have detected in the manual way we are doing the things today. So it's a start. We are starting with some workshops today, and we make a quick demonstration using some specific regions in the world and demonstrate the value of these technologies.
When you look at the potential to develop new capabilities in the near term, I hear lots of things from different vendors that are talking to me about how they're employing AI to affect some capability or another, and usually they're looking to sell it. What's the most important change in capability development? What new tool or what new enhancement in weaponry will come about as a result of today's trends in artificial intelligence? Do you?
Thank you for this question. I would say two. The main one is that everything we develop now, aircraft, ships, tanks, and even soldiers, they are connected objects. And if we understand that, we need to look at the digital architectures before we look at the objects that will be connected. Just to give you a very practical example of this, as my command has been tasked to develop very recently the future of the AWACS. The AWACS is this big aircraft with a mushroom on the top, which is radar. And we have been tasked to develop the new requirements that will lead to another AWACS in 2000 and a future capacity in 2030, 35. And many nations, they expected that we would develop that the old way, and the old way is we have a requirement that leads to a solution. And this is over. The requirement leads to a problem, and the study of a problem before the solution. And the problem is, what does an AWACS provide? And that provides surveillance and control. So what we have, instead of providing a solution, we have described what is surveillance and control in 2030, 35. What are the elements and the components of surveillance and control at this time? And then that leads to the development of digital architectures, and the key will be the digital architectures. What kind of data? What are the flow of data? How we organize it? And this is absolutely necessary that we define few architectures, we war game them, and at the end there will be probably not one solution, but many solutions that we will link them together. But this is really a new approach, and this is an approach that should associate what I call the traditional defense industry and industry that is not traditional in the defense sector, and especially industry specialized in data science. And we need to work together. But first, we need to start with the digital architecture. It's a main shift before what we have done before.
So what you're describing right now reminds me a lot of what I hear from different heads of services in the United States, the Air Force, the Navy, et cetera. When they talk about a vision for the future, they discuss a massive network of different objects, different platforms, soldiers with sensors connected with everything from drones to jets to satellites to command, an enormous interconnected web moving forward into the battle space. Now, if you talk about the United States military, that's a singular unit that can do that, that can move and operate almost as one. How is data sharing among the huge family that is NATO? Do you think that this presents a unique challenge?
Yeah, and that's one of the main challenges we have when we look at the use of these technologies. And this is always a challenge, data sharing. And but this is a very good challenge for our alliance, for NATO. And in fact, I am a strong believer that to improve data sharing, we need to make proofs of technology. And then based on that, we can say, now the key issue will be the data we get. If we get the right data, then we can improve considerably the way we work. And an example of that is what we call, there is something which is very important. If we had to go through a main crisis in the NATO area, which is what we call enabling secure ZOR, which is enabling the area of responsibility with logistics and the deployment of the forces and how we organize that, which is always a main challenge for our 29 nations. And especially if we had a main crisis with a lot of forces to be deployed. And the way to do that is, I mean, there is a huge room for use of artificial intelligence due to the complexity of the task. And but if we want to use artificial intelligence doing that, we need to have our nations provide us with the right data regarding the readiness, regarding the mobility, regarding the availability of the port of embarkation, debarkation, the lines of communication and everything. And what we intend to do is a proof of concept in the year to come using just open source. Open source, what exists on the map, what exists on the open publications, make a demonstration that with artificial intelligence we can improve considerably the way we would organize this area of responsibility. And then if we are able to make this demonstration to our nations, the next step will be to tell them, give us the right data. Those classified data on readiness and everything. If you give us the right data, we will considerably improve the level of readiness and the speed of decision making and the speed of deployment. But first, if we come to the nations today, just ask them to give all the data, it will not happen. We make the demonstration of the value of this technology, and this is, I think, the right way to do the thing.
Are there any players in NATO right now that seem more aggressive and open to this new approach compared to others? And how do you make sure that everybody stays sort of together in terms of their ability to develop this stuff, because it's such a wide group?
Yeah, another big question. And one of the key issues is sharing of data, but we have two other key issues regarding this, the use of this technology and how we have digital architectures that organize all of our combat system. Second issue is interoperability, and this is absolutely the key, especially with this kind of technologies. If we are not sure that we can connect together and share the data, we can provide the data, but we will not share them. So we need to develop standards. In fact, what we are doing in NATO, and there's a big role for my command, we are developing a standard which is called Federated Mission Networking, which is how we federate, through common standards, the different command and control systems and all systems from the different nations. And the value of it is it's a new way of thinking. So we have a spiral approach. So we start slow and we implement different spirals. And the Americans, they had developed another standard which was called the Mission Partner Environment, which was how they developed a standard to deal with their partners. And we have agreed last year, because my command is located in Norfolk, USA, to merge the two standards in one, which means that every nation in the world, it could be Japan, it could be South Korea, who is interoperable with US, it will be interoperable with NATO and vice versa, which is a huge change. And in fact, the way we develop that is we want to keep all the systems independent, because there is a huge sovereignty behind that, and there is even behind the sovereignty there are national technologies. Okay, keep your system, keep them independent, but then we create the highways between the different systems with a common language. And then that in the past, we tried to recreate big standards in order to tell nations, okay, now you need to give up your own systems, take these standards. It will not work. It's anytime we have done that, it resulted in overcost, over delays. So what we create now is keep your standard, but give us the requirements, and then we will create the highway again and the standard of communication. What it is about, this is an iPhone and a Windows computer. If you connect the iPhone with a Windows computer, nothing will work. But if you connect them through the internet and say it's a Word format, and the Word format, you will be the point doc format, you will be able to exchange information, even if in your iPhone, in your Windows computer, the way this doc format is managed is totally different. This is exactly what we need to do. And the second thing we need to do by design is cyber protection of these digital architectures. By design from the very beginning. Otherwise, it's going to be more difficult.
It sounds like distributed cloud architectures are going to.
This is exactly ultimately what we see. And when I talk about the federated mission networking, the standard we developed, we have already agreed on implementing the Spiral 1, Spiral 2, working on Spiral 3, 4, and 4, 5 will be cloud-like architectures.
Okay. See, this is really key, because one of the biggest fights that Washington is having right now is which company, Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, is going to win an enormous contract potentially worth $10 billion over 10 years to provide DoD with a single architecture, as you've just described, you want, as other leaders have said they want, for all of this compute. And it extends beyond DoD to NATO, potentially. And that's sort of amazing when you think about it, especially since these players are well known as consumer brands that we all face. So let's bring in the Americans now. Joining me on stage, General John Allen, retired, and retired Lieutenant General Howard Bromberg. Please have a seat.
We're flanking you.
Right, so General John Allen retired as the president of the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and retired Lieutenant General Howard Bromberg is vice president of strategy and business development, air and missile defense at Lockheed Martin in Washington, D.C. as well. So first to everyone, I wonder if you two, General Allen and General Bromberg, your opinion on the question on our poll, in 20 years, does artificial intelligence create greater security for us, or does it stand in the way of greater security?
I think it'll be more secure. I was going to say it depends, but I think if we pursue the kinds of regulatory processes that we have to in the future, because technology is actually racing far, far faster ahead than government can, we're going to have a regulatory approach to artificial intelligence, even in the military side. And I think if we are able to get those two in sync, I think we'll be much more secure.
So I agree. I think it will be more secure. In addition to the regulatory piece, but there's also, this is a human piece that's going to continue. We're not going to be able to stop innovation. It's going to continue and continue and continue. It has for hundreds of years, and we'll continue to innovate. And so we will come up with the right ways to regulate to improve and make us more secure. And we'll have to, because the world will change around us if we don't. Okay.
So again, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you all that if you have questions for us, we're going to try and incorporate them in. Go to slido.com, #GlobeSec2018. And you can also send us questions via Facebook Live once they start coming. Here's one. What is the role of NATO science and technology in harnessing AI? Has a list of priority areas of insertion been developed and agreed to by member nations?
In NATO, there is this organization, yes, Science and Technology Organization. Their role is to look at the future technologies and the future technologies that could be game changer for our capabilities. And my command is working very closely with them because they looked at these technologies, and this technology is much more than only artificial intelligence. We can talk about hyper velocity, and many other technologies. But what they do is they look at this from the technological point of view, and then what we do in my command together with them is to look at these technologies in terms of threats, how these technologies can threaten the NATO superiority, and in terms of opportunities and in terms of interoperability. So this is the way we are working, and we have a very recent document we update, which is a document that is called Framework for Future Alliance Operation, in which we look at the consequences of the trends I talked about to crisis on our military capacity. And for the very first time, we have associated the work that has been done by the Science and Technology Organization.
Okay. I want to go back to this question of regulation because I think it's really key to how we discuss this. The United States Defense Department has a doctrine in place since 2012 that mandates that a human has to be in the loop anytime a decision is made about lethal targeting. So however advanced artificial intelligence becomes, current Defense Department doctrine is a human has to make the ultimate decision. And this is somewhat of a distinction between the US Department of Defense and, you might say, peer competitors. So the question, General Allen, and also General Bromberg and General Mercier, as artificial intelligence advances, continuing to put pressure on the observe, orient, decide, and act cycle, escalating and accelerating the pace of war, what sort of pressure is going to be placed on that doctrine of keeping a person in the loop, and how do you protect it in the face of that pressure?
Well, this is a very complex subject, and we end up there pretty quickly in many of these conversations. General Mercier and Howard has also said a couple things. One of which is that hyperwar, by definition, is going to create an acceleration of operations in ways we can't now even perceive, in my mind. And as that occurs, from the capacity to detect the enemy, to identify the enemy, to get a positive identification, ultimately to make decisions necessary to deliver or to dispatch an autonomous system to surveil and engage that target. The faster we get in that loop, you called it the OODA loop, the decision-action loop, artificial intelligence is going to shrink that more and more and more until that circle begins to really collapse, so that we have just seconds sometimes to respond. I think we're going to have an issue with the human in the loop for some period of time. I can say with pretty high confidence that a number of our peer competitors are not worried about this. And one of the things that we talk about at Brookings when we write about artificial intelligence, whether it's about healthcare or the financial sector or military, is we use a term called ELSI. What are the ELS little I? What are the ethical, legal, and societal implications of artificial intelligence in this sector? It has to be preeminent and predominant for us as Western democracies that the human has to be in the loop at some point. Now, the consequence of that is when the human is in the loop and your peer competitors have taken the human out of the loop because they don't feel as compelled ultimately to be in compliance with the laws of armed conflict, which are very clear about the use of force and the capacity to discriminate combatants from non-combatants and proportionality. If they've taken the human out of the loop, by definition, they'll be able to move faster. So we're going to need to think in very, very serious ways, analytical ways, about how that human-like dimension is in the kill chain, ultimately to give us the kind of ELSI orientation that we have to. And it might be that we're driven at some point to a level of capacity and specificity within the algorithm itself, that we have trained that algorithm and we geo-fence the capabilities of that system to deliver ordnance in a way that gives us, as best we possibly can, the presence of the human in the loop. Otherwise, we'll just be slow. And in a hyperwar scenario, being slow means you'll be defeated. So we have to really work this issue out. And it is a issue we spend a lot of time on, frankly.
So if I could just add, I think, when we talk artificial intelligence, sometimes people think we're going to go to a free-for-all, as some of our competitors may indicate. I think this is going to evolve, and we'll get to that point. But the initial steps we have to take on the machine-to-machine interface or autonomy is making the human more effective, and to speed us up as fast as we can. And I think that's where we'll retain an advantage of doing that because we'll include the human dimension as we go through.
Let me come back.
So I think that's very, very important that we think how we do it. There's already cases today of where we can already increase our speed tremendously with keeping humans in the loop. But it's how we build it, how we practice it, and then how we develop it ahead of time. So I think that's where I would say we'd go.
And I'll add to what Howard just said. We're going to find ourselves in a hyperwar environment where we're going to be selecting and specifically training officers
Exactly.
to be able to exist in that environment and training them and educating them in ways where they have a bias for decision making that can occur at very high speeds. We have to modify the human, if you will, in terms of our decision making, neural pathways, in recognition, prime decision making, and intuitive decision making. We have to make that an inherent part of the human that's in the loop. And that's going to require us not just to perfect the algorithm itself, but also to perfect the officer and the individuals that are in the loop as well.
If I can just add something, because when we are talking about military issues and artificial intelligence, we'll always think about targeting and delivery of force. We will conduct a main exercise for NATO in November in Norway, and we will test for the first time a real-time with sensors on the soldiers, a real-time measurement of stress and everything. With this kind of sensors, we can detect a soldier that is wounded, and then with a certain level of artificial intelligence, we can deliver medical care to this soldier. We do not need a man in the loop for that. If we make a man in the loop, we will slow down the process, and we will save lives. That's the same for logistics. So artificial intelligence and the man in the loop, it depends on what we are talking about, and there are many issues that are not the delivery of force, but where we do not need a man in the loop. And then looking at what John Allen has said, that we can look at the man in the loop or on the loop. Sometimes we need to have the possibility for a leader, providing that he has been trained, as it has been said, that decides that I will not be in the loop. But he must decide it. This is what we call the man on the loop. And then he can decide that this time I let the machine do because I need a huge level of responsiveness or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the one hand, that's all very reassuring. At the other hand, though, the question is, should we decide on regulation to make these doctrines, these high ideals, into some sort of law? The DoD doctrine is just that. It's a doctrine, which is different from a law. Right now in the UN, there's a big conversation at the Conventional Weapons Organization, bringing in experts from around the world to see if they can first define what lethal autonomy is, and then potentially, long after that, potentially create international regulations around it. And I can tell you, after talking to many of the participants, they're not at all optimistic that they're ever going to reach a definition of lethal autonomy that all the parties, particularly China or Russia, will ever buy. What is the best venue to discuss potential regulations? Is it just militaries, commanders unto themselves talking with lawmakers? Or should there be, at least among the West, but perhaps within the NATO family, a different legal binding definition of what to do?
Well, a legal binding definition would imply that it's a law. So we are not to the point yet, especially with 29 nations, where I think we will be able, as you say, Patrick, to find the kind of commonality and specificity necessary for us to all agree to be bound by a law. Mm-hmm. But if we go back to and seriously consider what I said before about having a commitment to the ethical, legal, and societal dimensions of the use of artificial intelligence in war, and as General Mercier said, we'll be using artificial intelligence for maintenance, for real-time logistics, for wearable medical capabilities. We'll be using artificial intelligence where there's no human in the loop for much of what we're doing. It is when the decision is made to take a life that we're going to find the human that has to be in the loop on this thing in some form or another. As I said, there are technical ways that we might be able to go about this, but we've got to have the debate. We've got to start to talk about it now. I'm pretty sure that our peer competitors aren't worried about this. And so it requires a conversation in the U.S. anyway with our Congress, with the Department of Defense. I think that the public policy research institutes like Brookings and AEI and Heritage and the many others that are out there, CSIS, Council on Foreign Relations, all of them are interested in this today, and it is a nagging issue that we have to grip because of the nature of who we are as a liberal democracy and the liberal democracies of the EU and NATO. So this is an issue of human rights. It's an issue of the rule of law. It's an issue of just being ethically oriented in the way we go to war, which has characterized us for hundreds of years. So this is an issue that we've got to deal with. And I think bringing as many parties ultimately into this early in the process right now is the time to do it.
Okay. I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, and also if your opinion has at all changed on our primary question, go to slido.com, #GlobeSec2018. Please vote in the poll. Please send your questions out. And it's an important point because I think that a lot of the potential applications in artificial intelligence get lost in some of the fear and the concern. So, General Bromberg, what are some specific applications at Lockheed Martin that you're looking at for the future of artificial intelligence that might solve a problem that we're today talking about with great consternation?
So let me, before I get to that, if I could just go back to that last question for just one brief moment, because I think that dialogue needs to include industry. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't include industry early on in these discussions, we won't fully understand the art of the possible of what industry can then provide for solutions. So I think there's a dialogue that can happen there, because if there are going to be laws that come out of that, it's very helpful to know that as you start developing things, and that also helps us keep costs down. But to the last question, so I think specifically, this is about time and space. Everything is about time and space. So those are the two variables that you benefit with artificial intelligence, is maximizing or minimizing time in a certain space at time to maximum effects. So when you think about this, some examples we look, it's all about, not all of it's about, but a big piece of this is about networking, sensors, and shooters. You heard some other examples from General Mercer earlier. It's not just individual soldiers, but how do you network the platforms? How do you network the sensors together? So for example, F-35, tremendous platform, amazing sensors. Do you take that and you demonstrate that where you see a target from that F-35, but as it goes into the network, through some ground capability, you pass that to an Aegis ship platform who can then engage that target while the F-35 is off doing something else. Can you do that without a human? Well, there's a human in the aircraft, there's a human on the ship, but the effect of that is all done by the man-machine interface. So that's an example that goes back to the legal discussion. I'd like to give one other example, because I think there's something here about building trust as you go across generations to feel comfortable with artificial intelligence. So we just ran a demo, for example. It has to do with firefighting, not a defense one, but I think it's a good example. So the demonstration was finding an individual in a forest fire. A drone finds the hot spot of the fire. It tells another drone to go pick up water. It goes, picks up water. While it's doing that, a third drone is looking for the human. And then a fourth drone is the rescue ship to come in and pick the human up out of the forest fire area. All being run on a tablet by one individual. 4 drones, near simultaneous activity, finding a fire, putting it out, rescuing an individual, and bringing it back. One individual. That's not science fiction. That was done this year as a demonstration. But that application will start to build the trust and confidence in thinking that then can lead to kinetic effects. Because I think if we don't build the trust at the very beginning, and that's where Lockheed's spending its time right now, is developing that trust, innovating, because we have to be comfortable in that environment. So those are just 2 different examples, but both very realistic, both here today. Many other examples about networking sensors and shooters together. We're doing that in missile defense, and I can come back to that later, but that's absolutely key to being effective in the modern battlefield of the future.
Well, missile defense is sort of a key one. It's certainly on the minds of a lot of people right now as we watch the potential discussions with North Korea go up and down, exist, perhaps don't exist, collapse, perhaps not collapse, and the potential of artificial intelligence to potentially identify mobile missile launchers, things like this, and be part of a system that intercepts missiles during the boost phase when they're first taking off. This is part of a lot of the marketing that I see. And it would, of course, change the entire discussion with this adversary. But interestingly, it's also an example of how even benefits can turn into challenges if you don't foresee them correctly. There's an interesting report that came out from RAND in September. It's a largely speculative report, but it deals very much with artificial intelligence and missile defense and unintended consequences. And it hypothesizes that precisely because of those capabilities, the ability to target, for instance, mobile missile launchers, this might disrupt the very delicate balance of nuclear deterrence, because you're robbing your adversary of potentially their ability to defend themselves with first or second strike weaponry, nuclear weaponry. So what do you think of this? What are the unintended consequences of artificial intelligence in conflict, even when used to the highest ethical and moral standards? Do you worry about this idea of upsetting the balance of nuclear deterrence through artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think it can. I think it also has some stabilizing aspects to it as well. I want to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. For example, artificial intelligence will give us the capacity for indications and warning in ways we haven't seen before. The capacity to pick up anomalous activity through the ingestion and the analysis in near real time at light speed of huge amounts of data, which in many respects I think stabilizes the situation. And then once the launch occurs, it gives us the capacity for detection as well. And that capacity then feeds into the engagement process, which I think if we can speed all of that up, the capacity to detect anomalous activity, to detect the launch, to speed up the process for the command and control, potentially for the interceptors, et cetera, I think that's a stabilizing aspect of it. I'll just stop there. I think that's stabilizing, and I would like to see us think that through a bit more.
Okay. There's a question here on the pad I'd like to throw to General Mercier than everyone else. The idea of enhancing officers to make them more prepared for hyperwar is undeniable. The question is if we have the necessary means and intelligence to do so. I might ask you to elaborate a little bit on the Norwegian exercise you just outlined, like where is it, when, and how do we enhance the officer corps to deal with these new complexities? What's the best way to do it, and what's off the table?
Yeah, just this exercise in Norway, every 3 years NATO organizes a big live exercise. Live means that we are deploying real forces. It's going to be in November this year. We'll deploy more than 40,000 people and from more than 30 nations, because we have partner nations participating, ships, aircrafts, and everything. And we use this exercise because we deploy so many forces, not only to train these forces, but to make many experiments. And some of the experiments, one of them is what I've said previously regarding the measurement of stress of the soldiers in real time. But we will use, for the very first time, we'll make demonstration of how we can protect a logistics base with autonomous systems. And we have more than 20 experiments like this that are related to artificial intelligence autonomy. How we enhance our training? The first thing is, and that's a very important question, is human enhancement is an area where we are at the very beginning, and there are a lot of ethical questions behind that, but we'll have to consider them very, very carefully. But the first thing we can do with the technologies that exist today, we are still looking at our individual training on collectively, which means that we deliver the same training to everybody. And in our nations, and even inside our nations, nobody has the same skills. So with artificial intelligence, we can adapt the training. We can even, if we do that correctly, tailor the training to the specific people. And then based on that, we can enhance considerably, because of their own skills, their own excellence. Right. We can improve considerably the way we train them, and we reach some levels, and some of the skills we need them to have. So the use of artificial intelligence in education and training, but it's not limited to the military domain, is really an area which is very promising.
Very quickly, how far are we away from being able to do that with soldiers?
We have started in my command looking at that. So again, this is the beginning, but I think that again, the technology exists. So in 1-2 years, I'm very confident we'll be able to make some demonstrations.
Okay, if you have questions, please raise your hand. We've got folks walking around with microphones. Yes, here's one right here.
Yes, thank you very much, Mario Nicolini. A question here is on, again, building on the idea of training the soldier and keeping up with AI in order to have them in the loop. What's the implication for civ-mil there? Once you enhance soldiers, you probably have to also enhance the civilians in decision making. So how do you do that with the volatility of civilians in policy making?
Yep. If I may start?
Yes.
I think that to deal with the complexity of the environment today, no one organization, no one nation, and have all the keys we need to organize the ecosystem of that. And that's pretty much what is beyond your question. And this is why in my command, we have conducted a huge adaptation of the NATO command structure. And part of this in my command will have an area that will be focused on what we call the human capital and how we can train differently our people with the right skills to use these kind of technologies. And in fact, we are doing that with a huge ecosystem we are building with many universities across NATO's area and with others. And we have even an innovation hub that is available to everybody. And we use it in order to absolutely not limit what we are doing to our small military domain. So that answers your question, I believe.
But I would also say civilians need to be part of the exercise process as well. Typically, when we have exposed the civilian leadership to the enormity of the decision-making set, the decision set, and the speed with which the decisions must be made, it's sometimes almost an overwhelming experience. And so our sense has been having them as much as possible in the exercise process is very, very valuable.
And in addition to the government civilians, it's also, as you mentioned, academia and industry partners that can help. Because I think this is so broad, this affects so many people that if you don't bring all the best talents you have together, you'll never see the full capabilities and the full challenges associated with it. Finding those people is extremely important.
Howard's made this point twice already. The U.S. government, and I think more broadly NATO, we simply cannot do this without industry. Industry has to be a partner shoulder to shoulder with us in this process. They own the technology. They own the R&D. They're the ones who are actually putting the systems in the field. And if we don't do this as a partnership with industry, shoulder to shoulder with government and the military, we're just not going to compete. Because the peer competitors don't have those differentiations. Exactly. Yeah. They're all unified.
Yeah, and technology is not only the traditional defense industry, but this is always the industry specialized in information technology and everything.
That's right.
And the investment piece that comes with that. That's the huge piece.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, over here, please. Introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. Robin Shepherd, Senior Advisor to the Halifax International Security Forum. My question relates to the issue of how we convey what can sometimes be a somewhat terrifying message to the public and indeed to the politicians. And it strikes me, I'm currently working on a book called Realignment, Democracy in the Digital Revolution. And a lot of the research I've been doing, of course, is to read what people are saying about modern politics and also international affairs. And you would be astounded, or perhaps some members of the panel, given what General Allen said in the previous session, might not be astounded, how book after book after book is written about politics. And the digital revolution not only is not mentioned, it doesn't even make the index. And it strikes me after last November at the Halifax Forum, I hosted a dinner with General Hyten, the head of United States Strategic Command, and Eric Schmidt, executive chairman of Google. Now, it was off the record, so I won't relate what they said, but I can relate my own question, since I can put myself on the record, having been off the record. And that is this question of what exactly is it we're talking about? I mean, if you follow the Hollywood version, or even the Singularity University version of artificial intelligence, and you remember everyone, or many people might remember the movie Ex Machina, you're talking about kind of autonomous systems. Well, that isn't actually what we're talking about here. We're not talking about systems which can think for themselves. They are the thought processes introduced by human beings. What we're actually talking about here is automated systems. And this comes back to what a couple of the speakers have mentioned, that the question of what point in that process the human being gets involved. Of course, the human being is involved in setting the whole thing up, but at what point is there a kind of stop button? And I wanted to with the aim of actually in enlightening and taking away the fear from the public, to have each of the speakers refer to that. And also, at the risk of trying your patience, just a supplementary point to that is that we might be able to put our own people inside the process. But for speed's sake, if the other side thinks we can get an edge by not having people in the loop, or not having people in that chain of command before the kill is executed, how do we account for that in our sort of preemptive digital warfare strategy? Thank you.
I'll take a stab at the first piece. So I think back to your first one, what are we talking about? I think that is the ongoing discourse. I think first we're talking the simplest means is just simple machine-to-machine sharing of data. as I mentioned earlier, netting, sensors, and shooters. And that's where the artificial intelligence can help us the most because there's so much data out there. How do you maximize? I think it's just simply getting our arms around that as the first piece of it. And I think they are also talking about autonomy, but autonomy can be trucks that are driving by themselves, helicopters that are flying by themselves, airplanes that are flying to deliver logistics. Those cases are very simple, I think. And then you also are talking about both, I would divide it in the simplest terms of offensive or defensive activities. I think there are certain defensive activities where autonomy will be very well accepted if you're defending yourself or defending an area where you're probably pretty comfortable with letting a machine make a decision based upon some kind of threat scenario. Offensively, that's where you're probably going to get in more discussion. So I would start breaking it apart. But I think we're talking about all of those things together. But I still personally believe that we're a long ways from removing humans out of this because war by nature is a human endeavor and it's going to be for quite a while. So I think all of that is very, very broad, and I think that's why these dialogues have to start breaking this out.
But
It's interesting to reread Isaac Asimov, and he set three main principles regarding the future use of robots. The first one is robots should be programmed in a way that they will never threaten humans. And the second thing, they need to protect humans. And third, they need to protect themselves unless it could threaten humans. These kind of principles we need to think about. What are the principles we need to define? Because the technology is here, we will continue to make it happen. And I'm very interested with this principle from Isaac Asimov because I think they could be true.
isn't that Asimov's 3 laws? Isn't that them right there? The robot must do no harm, the robot, et cetera, et cetera. The whole book is filled with examples of that going like wrong. But to your point, one of the other things we're talking about here is China and Russia. And we've talked a little bit about where we perceive there to be an ethical gap in their deployment of these. But that's sort of a side issue to their level of technological development. Russian President Vladimir Putin last September made a sort of shocking announcement. He said, whoever leads in the field of artificial intelligence is going to rule the world. China, in its way, has spoken through policy and funding and has put together a massive strategic plan to become what it calls the world's chief center of artificial intelligence innovation by the year 2030. So first, how do you assess both these claims and these actions among these peer competitors?
Well, I'd be very attentive to the Russian intentions. I would have no reason to believe, based on their performance globally on so many other issues, that they'd be compelled to embrace ELSI the way we would normally do that. I don't know about the Chinese, frankly, and I see a very different, and let's remember the context in which Vladimir Putin said that. He basically was attempting to cheerlead the students on the first day of school. In other words, go to school, study, become engineers, and if you master artificial intelligence, that country will rule the world. I'm not sure that it was his intention, ultimately, to propose that Russia is going to rule the world, but there have been some statements made by Russian military leaders that have been very clear that they intend to create technologies associated with artificial intelligence targeted directly at the United States. China, on the other hand, I think if you go back and you read the materials associated with the 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping has been very clear that the roughly $150 billion that they intend to put into artificial intelligence research has many different applications. And it's not just a military. In fact, he doesn't make much emphasis on the military application. It's for the good of humankind. I'm not naive here, but it's for the good of humankind. It was just in Beijing, just in Chengdu, which is going to be a major center for technology. And it's about medical research. The capacity of having 700 million medical records in the database and the supercomputing which the Chinese can bring to bear on this sort of thing can profoundly change the way you can diagnose a disease and then get to the solutions, the solving of those disease issues associated with climate change, their capacity on transportation, et cetera, a commitment to using artificial intelligence for ecology and ecosystems. So I think that I'm less worried about the Chinese right now than I would be about the Russians. I'm very concerned and very attentive about how the Russians would apply artificial intelligence in a warfighting capability.
But you do perceive a technological gap that's beginning to emerge potentially between the United States and China, just in terms of capabilities and
Yep.
top-down
The
investment.
the United States is still in the lead. There's no question about that. And we will be in the lead for some period of time. But the Chinese intention ultimately is to be the world's leader in this technology by 2030. And that is an objective set by Xi Jinping in the 19th Party Congress. We will not be able to surpass them given the investments that we're making. The absence of a coherent national data strategy, the absence of a coherent national artificial intelligence strategy, and the absence of coherent American investment in this process, apart from what industry does. If we don't get some unity in this process, we will not be dominant by 2030. The Chinese will. But there's no reason why the United States has to give it up. We are leading technologically. We're leading in the context of big data. We're leading in not supercomputing anymore, but we're also leading in the context of algorithms. But the Chinese are putting resources into this that are almost impossible to imagine. And they will surpass us if we don't get active in this area.
Just to complement that, and because I had a discussion on this issue very recently with artificial intelligence experts, and this is exactly what they said, and what said by General Allen is, if you look at the technology, the improvement of the technology, definitely US is still definitely on the lead. However, what he said that in the use of the currently existing technology, sometimes China has a lead. And we can see that in many of their developments. They have trained thousands of engineers, and they are much better at using the existing technologies than us. We are already looking at what exists in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They use what exists today, which is huge, and they are much better than us to use today's technology.
If you all follow Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google Alphabet, it sounds very reminiscent to what General Allen just described, this need for a national coherent strategy, bringing together and aligning investment, academia, and business is something, the depth of it, he mourns greatly. So we have a question over here as well. Yes.
Thank you. Gianpaolo Di Paola, former Minister of Defense of Italy. My question, I mean, I've listened very carefully what have been said so far. And my question is, you have mentioned a lot of activity where artificial intelligence will play a major role in the future, all aspects of mankind. I'm wondering, I'm asking to you, I don't know, is that also artificial intelligence will have a role to play in politics, which is the most human-led activity I can think of? Thank you.
It already is. Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, exactly.
Cambridge Analytica is a good example of how the misemployment of personal data of scores of millions of people was used for micro-targeting of various potential voting groups to pass to that group by virtue of their online activity, monitored, analyzed, and stored by algorithms to target particular groups with certain kinds of information to bias them either to vote for something or not to vote for something, to have a strong opinion about something or to be angry about something. Artificial intelligence is playing an enormous role by those who would seek to influence populations in doing that. So it's already playing in politics.
So I want to follow up on that very quickly because there's a number of questions that are related to that exact topic. It seems sort of silly and far-fetched to talk about highly autonomous robotic systems leaping into the battlefield of 2030 when we can't get bots off of Twitter that are influencing our daily discussions about reality. At the same time, we have a ton of technological tools that can help reduce the level of misinformation, even some very advanced ones. We don't really have an overall political or policy solution to implement them. What's missing that's going to better help us defend ourselves from misinformation that is accelerated and fueled by very simple machine learning techniques? Anyone?
Well, I don't think social media can be neutral anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, there was this sense, I think, within the industry, and Howard, you could help me on this or someone else in the audience, but there was this sense that the social media platforms had to be politically neutral. And we've just seen what happened when they were. Mm-hmm. So I was really encouraged to hear Mr. Zuckerberg speak not long ago about how they intend to do what they can within the context of Facebook to work for the common good. Now, that's pretty tough to define. What's the common good? But they are actively, as are, I think, Twitter and some of the other large digital platforms, they're actively using artificial intelligence to detect the malicious and malignant activities that are occurring on those platforms and removing them before they can ever find their way between the eyes of a client or a partner. But we're going to have to do two things. I think that the digital entities are going to have to take personal responsibility for security matters, for security of the population, securing their data, and preventing the kinds of societal disruption that can come across those platforms. For example, the hate speech from the neo-Nazis, or the recruitment efforts by the Islamic State. A lot of that stuff is being culled out now. It shouldn't have to be about pornography. It shouldn't have to be about profanity. It shouldn't have to be about hate speech. There are other dimensions of the micro-targeting that has occurred of whole voting classes within the United States and frankly across Europe by the Russians that we're going to have to deal with. And the digital platforms is going to have to be where this occurs.
Well,
so there's a social responsibility there.
You have to bring this into the discussion because this misinformation. So before, if you looked at a kinetic effect, the chain is different now. You've got to bring in what you see in the social media realm. You got to bring in misinformation. You have to bring in the kinetic. You have to tie it all together now, and that's where I think the machine-to-machine artificial intelligence could really help us, because if you create the confusion in that, as I mentioned before, a particular time and space to mass effects, if you don't bring all that together, you're going to make the wrong decision, and that's where autonomy should help us. That's where we can get. Is that real information? Is it fake news? Not fake news? How do you bring it? And what's the effects of that? Second, third, fourth order effects. Because the last thing you want to do, go back to the other gentleman's point, is make a kinetic decision based upon fake news or based on some misinformation. But if we don't tie all that together, that's where we've got to start thinking about it. And that's not an easy thing to do.
That is tied to something that we need to develop, and again, that's complicated, but we call that multi-domain. We cannot imagine today a conflict with only the engagement of the traditional forces, air, land, air, maritime. So we need to integrate the information environment, exactly what you said. We need to integrate cyber, we need to integrate space, and this is a multi-domain approach. And what is behind that is that changes considerably the way we will structure our future operational architecture. And this is absolutely an effort we need to put on now.
How is NATO approaching that?
All of my command is we look at that, and we have started different initiatives in order to structure our future works. And when it will be mature enough, we will come back to our stakeholders in order to present that, because it's more complicated with 29 nations. But that's the same for the civilian world. The digital transformation changes considerably the way you organize your company or your organization, and that's the same for the military world. So instead of starting with the head and cascading the directive as we normally do, we need to start with what is the service we need to deliver to the customer, and the customer in the military is the airman, is the soldier, is the sailor, and then we need to reorganize the flow of data accordingly. But you need then to have more decentralized control of operation, which is something that is totally different from what we are doing today, except maybe some areas such as the special forces. So that will change considerably our operational concept, and we need to realize it.
Yeah. And so it seems like the only entity that has a single holistic answer to misinformation is the military, because misinformation can be useful for kinetic targeting, and everyone else has to deal with it as a great big mess. So we have a question over here. Yes.
Hi, Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University. I find the discussion very frightening, very alarming, and not just the capacity of the technology, but where your logic is going to drive society. Because several considerations. One, it seems to me you are militarizing the remaining civilian part of our society if Google or Facebook or Microsoft writes the code, it will be the end of our democracy, which is already fragile enough. So I cannot believe that I heard that this is where the military is intending to go, because we have enough problems with that. Second, I don't understand the problem that you're trying to solve. The United States, for 3/4 of the world, can already kill everyone that it wants without almost any casualties at all. We have such a disproportionate force, it's beyond belief. 2 days ago, our ally wounded 2,500 people without a single injury, killed 60. We applauded it. We do not have a moral standard, unfortunately, right now about that. And
I question that. I question that.
I'm asserting it myself. That's my view.
Well, I disagree with you.
Okay, that's fine. I appreciate
We do have
that.
a moral standard.
General, that's good. I believe we do not, because we launch more wars and we are killing more people.
Please.
And
Go ahead.
The last point I want to ask is, it is completely unrealistic to believe that we will stay, quote, ahead of China. So why are we not just witnessing the pure acceleration of the destructive capacity of the military on both sides that will lead us to disaster? I go to China all the time. They have every capacity that we have. They will have every capacity that we have or more. And so why are we not talking about standing down in this way on both sides and not militarizing cyberspace and trying to find solutions, rather than a pure arms race in this next realm of such unbelievable destructiveness? Thank you.
NATO, we are a defensive organization, and our purpose is to detect the early sign of crisis, de-escalate the crisis, and to be always defensive. And to do that in our world, we need to.
Well, let's let them answer, though.
And to do that in our world, we need to understand the technology, and we need to use the technology that will enable us to save lives. And this is and because your arguments are not true. Our organization, the purpose is always to be defensive, and what we are working on regarding these technologies is how these technologies will help us ensure more peace and security and save lives. Why do not consider that as an assumption?
NATO overthrew the government of Libya against international law.
Okay.
Talking about
Thank you, Dr.
different
Sachs.
things.
We're going to let people answer before we deal with absolutely every problem that NATO ever saw, witnessed, or whatever. Go ahead, Dr.
I don't have anything to say to that.
Okay. Well, it's interesting, because it does bring up.
Look,
go ahead.
every problem in the world doesn't start or end with the United States, Doctor. An awful lot of what's been good in this world, an awful lot of good that has happened since the end of World War II and the Cold War, has been a direct result of the presence of the United States in the global system. The United States that has led the formation of NATO, a United States that was a partner with the European Union, a United States that kept the peace in Northeast Asia all of this time. And we've had to fight to do it. We've paid a hell of a price for fighting to do it. But the United States is not the problem here. And there are countries around the world that are attempting to develop these capabilities, and we're going to develop them too, so that we can defend you and we can defend other people. And it looks bad sometimes to the observers who encounter this, but we have to do this. And artificial intelligence isn't just about killing. We're going to change medical research. We're going to change education. We're going to change productivity in this country. Artificial intelligence, from my perspective, is far more valuable to us in that context than in the military context.
Okay. Thank you. This is an important debate, not just here, but across the board, in part because as the military and defense sectors reach out to Silicon Valley, as they reach out to, again, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google to create an enormous cloud that's going to help fuel its projection forward, there's a lot of discussion right now. 3,100 Google employees recently signed a letter protesting their company's involvement in a pilot military AI project, Project Maven, which my outlet broke the news on. So on the one hand, within Silicon Valley culture, there seems to be sort of a civil war, at least within Google, about whether or not to trust different aspects of the United States military or the national security community with their tools, with the fruits of their labor. And I would ask how we earn, the national security community in particular, earns the trust of engineers around the world that work in Silicon Valley companies and never imagine themselves and have deep ethical reservations about becoming part of the defense establishment. How do you win that fight?
Well, I think by demonstrated performance, by being trustworthy. I'm frankly glad that those people signed that petition because they can, because they live and they work in an environment that permits them to have those kinds of opinions. And we ought to be listening to them. And if we find that is that many engineers in one place have that kind of reservation about the capacity of the United States, as the professor adequately said, to weaponize something that is probably much better for humankind than not, then we should be listening to what their concerns are. We ought to be paying attention to it. So I don't have any reservations about scientists and engineers having reservations about it. And the scientists and entrepreneurs who've joined together at the UN to sign a letter ultimately decrying autonomous lethal systems. I got no problem with that at all. Let's have the conversation to find out what their concerns are. And if we can engineer the kinds of controls into these systems that assuage their concerns, then we have done our duty, from my perspective.
Okay, do we have more questions? We do. Here we go, right here, please.
Hi, Danit Gal from the Cyber Civilization Research Center in Tokyo, Japan. I'm actually more concerned about the opposite. I don't think that there is an efficient surveillance system that is perhaps more efficient than Google or Facebook or Amazon that has a lot of data on us and know exactly what we're doing and building profiles on us. What I'm more concerned is about the fact that we're taking a technology that we do not fundamentally understand and use it in such an extent. I think that algorithmic bias is an issue so pervasive. We're going to take that and put that into a weapon. That just magnifies the situation. It creates enormous problems.
Sure.
So my concern is, do we understand the technology? You talked about designing it better. How are you going to do that? If we're going to take algorithms and systems that are designed to make profit, especially by doing these kind of biases. So my question is, how are we going to take that technology and make sure that it's actually better?
One of the sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
One of the issues regarding that is, and that's an essential question that you are raising, is technological awareness, technological understanding, and we are in a world now that we need to take that very seriously, and we need to make sure that people understand those technologies for exactly the reason you mentioned, and it should be part of all the education programs, because that's very important that at all levels. We have the same understanding of the technology. And same understanding means a lot. And this is why, for instance, in my command, we have started a program on autonomous systems. And the first thing is we try to work on taxonomy, just to be sure that our 29 nations, when we talk about things, we put exactly the same meaning behind the word, which is absolutely not the case. That's the very first thing we need to do, and then we need to understand the same thing. And by understanding it, we will understand the threats, and we will understand how it can be used badly, but we will understand how it can be used in a very good sense. So we can use it for again, as it was mentioned, medical systems and many other things. Understanding the technology is key.
I was just going to add. I mean, you mentioned Google platforms and other things, but there's other platforms that are already in use today that can be maximized. So it's things that we already understand as well. And we hear this all the time as we go around and talk to different of our customers. They know there's a threat out there, a complex threat. And so how do they take those platforms today that are already approved for existence, understanding that and even maximizing those to increase the human performance? It's not necessarily about just taking this code or whatever and just dumping it into a military system. There's a much longer process to go through. And I think we're just on the beginning phases of understanding all that and how to put all that together.
And I would applaud your question in the context of we've got a lot of work to do on algorithmic bias. We really do. Gender bias, racial bias, all of those things, because as you know from your own experience, so much of the data that we get is biased when we get it. And so you crunch the data and you put it in an algorithm that uses that data, and it automatically is biased. We've got a lot of work to do on that in order to try to remove that bias out.
So this reminds me, there's a very good book out now very recently called Prediction Machines, which makes the case that the ultimate burden of artificial intelligence will be that it increases the premium on human judgment. It actually makes human judgment more valuable because the different systems are doing so much of the analysis work and even the predicting work, presenting the operator, the commander, the general with different options that are all far more credible. So all of you are commanders here. You've all occupied positions of tremendous authority, sending human beings into battle. How do we ensure that artificial intelligence is an enhancement to human judgment and not a detractor? And are you worried about that threat? How do you see the trend going now?
Which threat is that, Patrick?
The possibility of artificial intelligence actually decreasing our capacity for good judgment at the command level by outsourcing too much to machines that do the thinking for us, as it were.
Well, I don't think we're going to wake up one morning and have a machine that does that for us. I think we're going to increment, as we'll increment a process of development, which, whether it's intelligence, whether it's detection or intelligence analysis or decision support for commanders, we will increment our way, both in terms of the kinds of data that we use, the computing power that we bring to bear, and the nature of the algorithm itself, to the point where we have confidence that that algorithm will present us with credible options. Mm-hmm. And because we will have probably been selecting officers who can operate in the hyperwar environment from the time they were second lieutenants to the time they make general, we'll have the capacity to recognize whether those alternatives make sense or not. But we're just not going to wake up one morning and a commander is going to be presented with three options that was spit out by some algorithm. We're going to have the human and the machine and the algorithm are going to have to have evolved together to a point where we have confidence that the decision support matrix or the decision support options actually make sense and are credible.
Well, and this question is ultimately one also of data integrity and verification and trust in an AI system.
That's right.
How do you ultimately get to a point where you have a system that's outputting results for you to influence your decision space and you can have perfect credibility in it? Is there a single solution?
No, there will never be perfect credibility. But again, there's three things that you need in order to succeed here. One is data that is trustworthy. So you have to understand the sources of the data. Mm-hmm. You have to have the capacity to clean it if it comes from a questionable source. You need to have the computing power that can ultimately reduce that data and the algorithm that gives you the output that you want. All three of those things have to be developed together, and then you have to protect it with some form of cyber defense as well. So those three things are going to be developed together. The algorithm will be developed at the same time that you're marshaling the computing power, at the same time you're identifying the data sets that you need and ensuring that there is a cleanliness to the data that can ultimately support your ends.
Okay. So this is not a small point on building trust over time. All those things together, safety, reliability, efficiency, effectiveness, to build that whole, what you want is this holistic view of the future battlefield so that trained and educated commander over time can then use that. I go back, as I said it before, is to maximize their potential to make the best decision. But again, I agree, this is not going to be an overnight, this is not going to be, boom, we're doing it tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. And I think there's ways to do that through training, education, partnerships, both at the governmental level and at the military levels and at the industry level that will build that trust and confidence over time.
What we are saying here is that there are two strategic resources in our world today. That's data and human capital, and how they interact together. And this is exactly what it is about. And then the key question will be how we will design our future digital architectures to be sure that we have the man at the right place, and how the machine can can enhance the man and the validity of the data. I can take that the other way around. We have huge amount of data today, and with artificial intelligence, we may be able to detect something that is abnormal much more than if we do not use these kind of tools as well. So it could be very helpful as well.
Yeah. Okay, another question here. We go. Rand Waltzman, I believe. Yes. Hi, Rand. He's from DC, I know. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a slightly more technical question, sort of related to the last question. And so most people don't know that modern statistical machine learning techniques, when they produce a result, it's completely opaque. So you have no idea actually what the system is really doing. I mean, this is just how the technology works, right? So the question is, given that, and given that you don't know really what it's triggering off of, how do you my question is why I almost never hear any talk about how you do testing, verification, and validation of a learning system which is designed to adapt to a non-deterministic real-life environment. So that's the first part of the question. But the second part of it is, so how, I also hardly hear anybody talk about how you defend against data attacks on a learning system. So for example, how do I know I can't take a system? Well, I know I can take any kind of a learning system, and I can systematically feed it data to lead it down a garden path to end up doing something completely unknown. And doesn't seem to, people don't seem to be putting much money into into those kind of questions.
Yeah.
Well, on this, Rand used to be a program manager at DARPA. DARPA has programs in both of these areas right now, but a lot of DARPA programs start, and then who knows what happens to them. But yes, please go ahead.
Well, I don't know that they're not, to be quite honest with you. And as you pointed out, they're extraordinarily important to ensure we don't have data corruption that is intentional in the manner that causes the algorithm to act in a biased way that we can't stand. But the other piece of this is how the algorithm ultimately educates itself and how it ultimately produces the output that we're looking for. I don't think we know that, as you say. I don't think we know that in all of the mathematical reasons for how it gets to that point, which is going to require that we have the capacity inside the system to constantly be monitoring the output to ensure that we're getting what we need.
Go ahead. All right, any other questions? Here we go, right here in front. And also log on to slido.com, #GlobeSec2018, and send your questions there. And also please remember to vote in the poll, because we're very interested in your opinion on that. Go ahead, sir.
Rod Rines with Palantir Technologies. I'm also on the World Economic Forum Future Counselor for International Security. How do you see the development and diffusion of these AI technologies speeding and confusing escalation protocols, reducing transparency of the origin and nature of threats, and ultimately impacting the options available to decision makers?
Yeah, I think we know that the opponents are going to be creating their own networks, which will be spoofing networks, and I think that's going to be a major issue for us as we go on.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I think this kind of goes back to the other gentleman's question a little bit. They're
called generative adversarial networks. I'm sure you're aware of that, and it will look like a real network, but the AI algorithms will be spitting these things out, and we'll have to decide whether it's a real network or a false network, and a lot of time can be spent operating against them.
I think the challenge for us is going to be building the environment to test, train, educate, and learn. You mentioned testing, but it's the learning piece. So how do we put ourselves in that context repetitively over time to understand it? I think that's where one of our big challenges is going to be. And then finding the right talents, not just in the engineering side, but also on the policy side that can come to bear and question those activities. We're going to have to get in a very questioning mode, question everything as we go through it so we understand it better.
Another challenge for us is to do that with 29 nations. And I mentioned that because I talked about interoperability and technical operability. We will always solve the problem because the technology, we will figure out that. But my worry regarding all these things with 29 nations is the political interoperability, and this is why we need to discuss these issues, we need to test them, we need to learn together, and we need to be sure that in the future, at least our 29 nations, they will have the same agreement of the how we will design this network and the use of the technology, the political, the ethical part. And this political interoperability is a big issue. At least this is good because it's 29 nations, but it has difficulties.
Okay. Other questions? Well, I wonder if we have a lot of different solutions that involve training, that involve better understanding and data that comes in, subjecting it to a level of scrutiny that we're not subjecting it to at present. Are the solutions to cleaning up this space, are we adopting them as quickly as we're adopting technology that we haven't fully understood yet?
I think it goes to the question a moment ago. Are we creating inherently in these processes and in this development the kinds of checks and balances necessary to ensure that the neural networks or the deep learning is in fact remaining true to the outcomes that we desire? And we ought to be constantly questioning those processes to ensure that if in fact it's beginning to stray, that we shut the system down or we take whatever corrective action is necessary.
Yeah.
It has to be inherent in the process. These things can't be permitted because they're learning, they're teaching themselves. You know, AlphaGo, that whole process, for those of you who are aware of it, was it AlphaGo or AlphaZero? AlphaGo was the system which was trained to play the game Go. Right. It was trained on all the data that was available.
Right.
It trained itself how to play Go, the Asian game, and in the end defeated the finest players in the world, AlphaGo. The next iteration of that algorithm, AlphaZero, all the data was stripped out. It was focused on chess, and 8 hours into its self-learning, it was as good as chess champions anywhere in the world. And 24 hours into it, it was beating almost anybody that had played it. So, to the point that was made a few minutes ago, these algorithms have the capacity to teach themselves. They'll play against themselves, and they'll teach themselves. They'll also assimilate data and teach themselves. There has to be a check in that process to ensure that the outcome is where we want the outcome to be. And if not, then we have to take it offline or we have to take whatever corrective action is necessary. I can't describe what that is for any particular algorithm, but in principle, that has to exist as we move forward in this process.
Is there a risk of relinquishing all the capabilities that are open to us through advanced neural networking because there is such opacity in the method by which it reaches a conclusion? The financial sector is perfectly happy to accept outcomes in terms of decisions about stock trades if they can balance the potential loss against the potential gain. Public policy people notoriously are not because they have to respond to a voting public. They have to say, the reason we deposited police officers on this block is because a neural network told us to do it. No politician wants to go before voters and make that explanation. It's a completely different sort of problem set. So there are sectors of the economy that seem much more willing to embrace these rather opaque neural network systems, whereas in the public policy sphere, this is where we actually get the checks and balances. Is there discontinuity between the way the private companies and different sectors of the economy embrace some of these more exotic artificial intelligence techniques versus the public sector, and is that gap worrisome?
Well, I think to their great credit, the private sector has in fact been embracing the issues associated with that term I use called ELSI. In fact, that's a term I think either comes from Facebook or Google. Again, being oriented, I think it's really important, and I really applaud them for this, and it has to be inherent in what we do. The ethical dimension of what we do can't be the afterthought. It has to be engineered at the front end of this thing. When we see the process beginning to come off track, whether it's ethically or legally or is societally objectionable, then that has to factor in the way we move forward with the process. It can't be an afterthought, and I really applaud the private sector for bringing that into it. Now, we may need to have more legislation or more of a regulatory process or develop local policy to effectuate the outcome we need locally. We may need to do that. But if I think the private sector, and I know it is committed, at least the private sector in the world that we live in, is committed to ELSI, as I've described it, I think that's a very important commitment to undertake. And that, to me, gives me some level of confidence that this is not just a process that's going to be left to run on its own until we find the catastrophe that was implied previously in the question.
All right, who in the private sector do you see that's using this technology that's not committed to ELSI?
I can't speculate at this point.
No? I'm sure he's out there.
There's plenty of them are out there. I mean, the whole organizations, there are organizations that offer cloud computing for anybody that can that can pay for it. And so there I worry about the transnational criminal networks. There I worry about the non-state actors. And they're not confined, or they're not compelled ultimately to be as committed to this as are the private sector giants or the private sector emerging companies that we've seen. But there are elements around the world that's very happy to provide the cloud computing you need necessary to crunch data and to build the algorithms necessary. And this is a threat issue that we're dealing with today.
Yes, we're extremely careful about how we do our processing and how we tie to the requirements of whatever customer's dealing with. We operate under the highest standards possible in this space, and it's a continued concern to us. We're constantly check in these areas.
Well, so, and this actually brings up a really interesting point. Earlier on, you described a swarm scenario where a variety of different platforms were able to autonomously identify a heat source within a forest and deliver fire effects to that. And now we brought up the question of non-state actors, smaller groups. And I've been covering ISIS for the last 14 months, and you're deeply familiar with this group. They've begun to use off-the-shelf consumer drone and swarm technologies to tremendous effect.
Right.
How do we keep these technologies that we're today discussing between the United States, China, and Russia, how do we keep them away from dangerous non-state groups, or can we?
Well, I think two things. One is you can't keep certain technologies away just by protective measures, whether it be in the cyber realm or whether they be in how you protect your systems, certainly as we've deployed in the past and will deploy in the future. But I think there is an element out there that is always going to be at risk of this, because much of this technology is openly available already. So then you have to look at how do you defend against that, so you don't have a bad actor doing something unintentionally. We've seen other examples already with certain customers where that civilian technology has already been applied in a combat situation with devastating results. And so we're constantly looking, can you defend against it? Can you protect against it?
We need to have more global approach when we want to address this. Let me give you a parallel with the improvised explosive devices that we have discovered many years ago in our theaters of operation. You know that this explosive, which is somewhere and then blows up when we have forces in the vicinity. And the key issue we have seen to better protect from these devices was not to have more armored vehicles. Again, it would have been the first solution. What we have done is we have looked at who is funding these things, who is providing the electronics, who is providing the explosive. So we made tremendous success is fighting against these things, because we had a global view, and we attacked the network, and not only the technology itself that was used. And this is what we need to do for the use of these technologies by terrorists, because we will not prevent them from doing that. But we need to have this global view of what are the networks, how they get these technologies, what are the key people, and this is what we need to understand, because this is the best way to protect from this.
Okay, all right. So we've had a pretty amazing, fascinating discussion here, and if you'll all remember, we had a question at the beginning, which was 20 years from now, advances in artificial intelligence will make the world more secure. General Mercier, who is among one of the only optimistic French people that I know, was super excited.
We need at least one. That's probably because I live in USA today.
Yeah, right, lives in
The power of one.
Right.
Power of one.
The entire panel was unanimous in their sense that it would, but we've outlined the road ahead, and it's a difficult and complicated one. Let's take a look at the poll as it stands right now. Yes, and it's a change. It was 52 to 48%, and now it's 57 to 43. So we've grown slightly more pessimistic as we've discussed this. You are welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Please help me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.
That was very good.